On a clear morning in 1872, a merchant vessel drifted into Charleston harbor and docked, without a distress signal or a scratch on her hull. No one stood at the wheel to guide her in, and the dock hands who eventually tied her off found the deck completely empty. They searched the rigging and the hold, but could not find a single soul on board, leaving 11 men missing without a trace. Down in the cabin, the captain's log sat open on his table, with the ink still wet on the final entry. The last sentence broke off in the middle, as if he had simply stopped mid-thought and walked away. Yet he hadn't gone anywhere that a search party could ever find. Where those 11 men went, and why this story vanished almost as quickly as they did, is what we are here to uncover. By 1872, Charleston was a city that had not finished grieving and certainly had not started to recover. The war ended 7 years earlier, but you would never know it by standing on the waterfront and looking at the decay. The wharves that once made this city the commercial heart of the Atlantic were rotting where they stood, with pier planks splitting and warehouse roofs opening up to the rain. Low tide always brought a heavy smell of salt and mildew that clung to the old timber of the docks. Federal troops were still a constant sight on the streets, acting as the face of a Reconstruction era that the local merchant class hated with a bitterness that touched every business deal they made. Shipping was slowly returning to the harbor, though the terms of trade had changed forever. Before the war, the city moved cotton and rice through a port built entirely on enslaved labor, but that old system had been torn out by the roots. What replaced it was something much thinner and more dangerous for the men involved. Small operators now ran coastal schooners and two-masted brigs between Charleston and the smaller Carolina inlets, carrying whatever lumber or tobacco the brokers could scrape together. The crews were underpaid and often barely documented, consisting of men who signed on with whoever happened to be hiring that week. The Gloriana was exactly this kind of ship, a two-masted coastal trader so modest you would pass her in the harbor without a second look. Her owner was a local cargo broker, whose name shows up in the customs ledgers alongside dozens of other small-time operations. During that season, her route took her between Charleston and several stops along the Georgia coast to pick up the ordinary freight of a broken economy. She carried timber and dry goods, nothing exotic or valuable enough to attract any unusual attention from thieves or rivals. We have to consider the specific question the dock hands were whispering to each other that morning, because it changes everything. Men vanished from ships all the time in the 19th century, whether they fell overboard during a storm or died of fever in a distant port. Usually, a disappearance happened out at sea, where the vast distance could explain away the loss. But the Gloriana was different. She didn't lose her crew in the middle of the Atlantic. She actually made it home. She was tied to a Charleston dock with her cargo intact and her lines properly secured. Yet the men who sailed her there were simply gone. The portmaster's office officially logged the discovery later that morning. It is not entirely clear from the surviving records who filed the first formal report, but by midday, someone with authority had finally come down to the pier to see the empty ship for themselves. What they found when they went below was not chaos, and that is the very thing that made the discovery so strange. A ship that loses her crew to violence, a mutiny, or some sudden catastrophic event usually shows the scars of the struggle. You expect to see broken equipment, gear thrown across the deck, or perhaps blood staining the wood. But the Gloriana showed none of those signs. Her hull remained perfectly sound. The rigging showed no damage beyond the fraying of ordinary wear, and nothing in the hold had been disturbed. In the crew quarters, the personal effects of the men sat exactly where they had been left. Boots were placed neatly by the bunks, and a half-smoked pipe rested on a small shelf with the tobacco gone cold and dry. A coat hung from an iron nail near the forward hatch, which tells us that, whoever these men were, they had not packed their bags. They had not taken a single item you would grab if you knew you were leaving that ship for good. The galley told that same haunting story of a life interrupted. Food sat in various stages of preparation, as if the cook had simply stepped away from a job he fully intended to finish. This kind of domestic detail is actually harder to explain than wreckage, because wreckage at least implies a specific event took place. This implied something much more unsettling, like a clock that simply stopped ticking in the middle of the day. The captain's quarters were kept in a similar state of order. Charts were spread across the table, and the logbook sat open to the final page. The last entry was dated and positioned normally in the sequence of daily records, but then the writing just stopped. It did not end at the completion of a thought, or even at the end of a sentence, and some accounts say the pen ran dry in the middle of a word. The cargo hold remained untouched. Whatever the Gloriana had been carrying was all there, correctly stowed, and with nothing missing from the manifest. That single fact rules out any simple explanation involving piracy, because pirates do not tend to leave the cargo behind. The wheel and the running rigging showed no signs of emergency handling, and there were no rope burns or fouled lines to suggest a struggle with the sea. Someone had brought this ship into the harbor in reasonable order and secured her lines. But then, there was nothing left to indicate who that person was or where they went. The captain's name appears in the customs records of this period with several different spellings, which shows you how little the authorities cared about tracking these coastal operators. What the records do agree on is that he was an experienced coastal pilot rather than a deep water man. He was someone who knew the Carolina inlets and the shifting sand patterns around the sea islands the way a farmer knows the rows of his own fields. He had been running this specific stretch of the coast for at least a decade, and other Charleston shipping men described him as a reliable character. He was not a brilliant man or particularly well connected, but he was the kind of captain who delivered his cargo on time and kept his crew from killing each other. His crew consisted of 10 men working beneath him, which meant there were 11 souls total aboard the vessel. Their origins were scattered across the usual geography of a mid-century coastal crew, including a couple of men from Charleston and at least one from the Outer Banks of North Carolina. There were likely a few freedmen working as deckhands, which was a common sight on southern coastal traders during this era. After emancipation, freedmen took maritime work in significant numbers, often filling the least desirable berths for the lowest possible wages to keep the post-war coastal trade moving. Their names appear in some accounts only to disappear in others, and that inconsistency is a form of evidence about who the record keepers actually thought mattered. A few of these men had served together on previous voyages under this same captain. That kind of continuity was common on small coastal operations, where a captain would find reliable men and try to hold on to them for as many runs as possible. It does not necessarily point to unusual loyalty or some hidden conflict, but rather the ordinary working arrangement of a short-haul crew who knew each other's habits. The route they took that season started in Charleston and headed south, with stops documented in port records at 1 or 2 Georgia coastal locations. Cargo was picked up and dropped off along the way, in the ordinary rhythm of small tonnage freight. The timeline puts the Gloriana back in Charleston waters within just a few days of her last recorded departure, which means whatever happened to them did not happen very far from home. Other vessels working that same stretch of water may have seen her during those final days. There are references in later accounts to harbor pilots who reported passing the Gloriana while she sat at anchor somewhere south of the bar. She was sitting quietly with no unusual flags flying and nobody visible on the deck to call out for help. That detail is hard to verify from a single source, but it appears often enough in the record to suggest it came from a real witness. The last confirmed record of any crew member being alive is that final entry in the captain's log. After that date, not one of those 11 men ever surfaces again in a port record, a census entry, or a newspaper account. They were there on the water, and then the ledger simply has nothing more to say about them. The inquiry that followed was not, by any standard, a serious investigation, and that is not an accusation so much as a description of what the resources and the politics of 1872 Charleston actually allowed. Jurisdiction over the vessel belonged to the Port Authority, while local law enforcement held the rights to any potential crime, and federal customs agents still stationed in the city as part of the Reconstruction apparatus had their own interest in the merchant vessel. In theory, 3 separate offices had every reason to pursue the truth of what happened to the crew, but in practice, this meant 3 separate offices had reasons to defer to one another. The result was a vacuum where no single body possessed both the authority and the motivation to push for real answers. What the physical evidence pointed toward was a controlled departure rather than a catastrophe, and nothing in the early findings contradicted the scene as the dock hands first described it. The ship was orderly, quiet, and complete. Because there was no blood, the investigators ruled out violence on board, and the lack of damaged rigging meant they could rule out a sudden storm. Since no cargo was missing, they knew it wasn't a quick looting, which left the men in charge constantly arriving at what the scene wasn't, while finding it harder to say what it actually was. No bodies were found on the ship or in the harbor, and nothing washed up along the adjacent shoreline in the days that followed. A harbor death in 1872 did not always produce a recoverable body, because the tidal currents around Charleston move fast, and the sea islands to the south offer 1,000 places where a man could strand unseen for weeks. Still, the absence of any remains at all for all 11 men was noted by the authorities, and it was a problem that didn't have a clean answer. The theories circulating among the investigators in those first days ran along predictable lines, starting with the idea of mass desertion, where the crew simply decided to walk away from their contracts. Foul play from a third party was another working assumption. Perhaps some confrontation at sea before the ship made port. Or maybe a falling out among the crew that ended badly and left the survivors with reasons to disappear. The federal customs agents who examined the vessel filed a report that still exists in the administrative record, though the surviving contents are fragmentary at best. What remains suggests they found no evidence of smuggling or hidden compartments, and there was no discrepancy between the manifest and the cargo significant enough to flag. Their interest in the case appears to have cooled quickly after that, because a ship with a clean manifest and no missing goods was not a customs problem. The local Charleston papers covered the discovery with a careful framing that stayed close to the surface without ever pressing for the truth. They wrote about a strange occurrence at the harbor and a crew unaccounted for, using the kind of language that acknowledges a thing happened without actually looking at it. No editorial demanded answers from the city, and no reporter seems to have gone down to the dock with a notebook and a set of hard questions for the Port Authority. The press in Reconstruction Charleston was navigating its own set of pressures between the federal occupation and a merchant class trying to rebuild its reputation with northern trading partners. And a story about an unexplained mass disappearance was not something anyone with commercial interests wanted amplified. The investigation closed without a formal conclusion, which is the plainest way to state that there was no verdict and no ruling on who was responsible. The case did not close because it was solved, but rather because it simply stopped being worked by men who had other things to do. The Port Authority moved on to other filings, while the customs agents found other vessels to inspect, and whatever local law enforcement contributed has been lost to time. What got left behind was the ship herself sitting at the pier for weeks after the inquiry wound down, along with the open log in the captain's quarters and 11 names in the port ledgers. The official record stopped exactly where the investigation stopped, right in the middle of a sentence, which is either a strange coincidence or the most honest thing the record managed to say. To understand why the investigation stopped, you have to understand what Charleston's port actually was in 1872, which was a far cry from what it had been or what its boosters claimed it would become again. Before the war, Charleston ranked among the busiest ports on the Atlantic seaboard, moving cotton in volumes that shaped global textile markets and dictated the wealth of nations. The infrastructure to handle that volume had been built over generations and was maintained by an economy that no longer existed. What the war left behind was the physical skeleton of a major port sitting inside the economic reality of a hollowed-out region, where the piers were still there, but the money was gone. The shipping contracts and the reliable freight lines had moved to Baltimore and New York, and those northern cities showed no particular urgency about coming back to the South. Charleston's Port Authority was understaffed in a way that reflected this contraction directly, and the men running it were simply operating a major port's administrative apparatus on a minor port's budget. They were working with a fraction of the personnel and aging equipment, and their record-keeping systems were not keeping up with even the reduced volume of traffic they were handling. When something fell outside the ordinary categories of their work, they had procedures to follow. But when an entire crew vanished from a docked vessel, those procedures simply didn't reach far enough. There were other incidents along this stretch of coast in the years surrounding 1872 that never got connected because there was no mechanism for looking at the bigger picture. Small vessels came in short-handed without explanation, and a mate disappeared from a Savannah-bound schooner whose absence was logged but never investigated. A crew dispute on a timber carrier out of Georgetown produced a customs filing and nothing further. And while none of these are the Gloriana's story, they share the same institutional outcome of a brief notation in a ledger followed by silence. The economic pressure running underneath all of this came from the cargo owners and the insurers who were working with thin margins and fragile relationships. A scandal attached to your vessel was the kind of thing that cost you contracts you couldn't afford to lose, even if you had nothing to do with the trouble. The Gloriana's registered owner had every financial reason to want the matter handled quietly and filed somewhere that wouldn't come up in conversation with a Baltimore cargo broker. Insurance claims in maritime cases were complicated enough without an open investigation drawing attention to the specifics, so a quiet resolution served the commercial interest better than a prolonged public inquiry. Reconstruction politics added another layer underneath the economic concerns, because the federal officials stationed in Charleston were there to oversee the political reorganization of a defeated state. Their priorities were clear, and any inquiry that might embarrass local white commercial interests risked complicating the already difficult work of maintaining a relationship between the occupation administration and the city's merchant class. A missing crew was a tragedy for the families involved, but from the federal perspective, it was not a political problem worth manufacturing. What you get when you combine an underfunded port authority with commercially motivated silence is not a cover-up in the way we usually think of them. It is something more ordinary and in some ways harder to fix, because it is a system that was never designed to find out what happened to 11 men that nobody powerful was asking about. The official record simply stopped, and into that silence, theories moved in the way they always do when institutions fail to produce answers. They came sideways from the waterfront and the boarding houses near the docks, whispered by men who worked the harbor and held opinions they never intended to put in a ledger. Mutiny is usually the first idea to be floated in any reconstruction of this case, mostly because it seems like the obvious answer when a captain and his crew vanish at the same time. But mutiny does not quite fit the scene, and the reason it fails is the state of the ship itself. A successful mutiny almost always produces survivors, or at least a change in ownership, because someone has to take the ship, and someone needs to benefit from what is on board. This usually means the cargo gets moved, and the vessel gets sold or scuttled, or sailed to a far-off port under a different name. The Gloriana came in with her cargo untouched and her lines properly tied, which means if this was a mutiny, the killers forgot to take anything, and then, apparently, forgot to go anywhere either. You can try to build a theory around this evidence, but you will spend all your time patching the holes. The gas theory is less dramatic and probably more scientifically grounded than anything the investigators in 1872 would have considered. Methane and carbon dioxide events at sea were documented in this era, even if the people living through them did not fully understand the chemistry. A pocket of gas rising through shallow coastal water could incapacitate an entire crew so fast that nobody had time to raise an alarm or make a controlled decision about anything. Ships working the Carolina coastal shallows, around the sea islands and the tidal inlets, were moving through exactly the kind of sediment-rich, low-oxygen environment where these methane events were possible. If everyone on board was overcome at the same moment, the ship could have drifted on the current and tide into the harbor on her own, with the lines getting secured by whoever first climbed aboard and found the scene. This theory explains why there was no violence and no sign of a struggle, but it requires us to believe that 11 bodies simply went somewhere, either overboard or into a space that investigators missed. It is not impossible, but that is a lot of bodies to lose without a trace. Piracy comes up often, then gets set aside, then comes back in a slightly different form. The standard version of piracy, where someone boarded the Gloriana to steal the cargo and kill the crew, dies the moment you see the untouched hold. But there is a version of this theory where the cargo was never the point, and what actually got taken off that ship was the men themselves. Impressment was legally abolished by then, but the illegal forcing of sailors onto undercrewed vessels still happened along this coast well into the late 19th century. A crew of 11 coastal sailors, none of them particularly famous, and most of them lacking proper paperwork, was exactly the kind of human inventory that certain operators in the gray economy of Reconstruction-era port towns would have wanted. The smuggling angle runs parallel to that idea, and it does not require any exotic imagination to see how it might have worked. Post-war Charleston had a black market economy operating at a massive scale beneath the legitimate freight trade, and it is possible the Gloriana was carrying something off the manifest that a third party wanted badly enough to kill for. This does not require a grand conspiracy, only that one cargo broker made a deal he did not record, and the men on the other side of that deal decided they were not interested in leaving any witnesses behind. Mass desertion is the theory that sounds the least like a ghost story, which might be why it feels closer to the truth. Sailors walked away from ships and lives constantly in this period, often in coordinated groups when the conditions on board became bad enough to justify the risk. 11 men deciding in those final hours that they were finished with the sea and scattering into the Carolina Low Country or the freedmen's settlements is not operationally impossible. It requires a level of collective silence that strains belief, but people made decisions to disappear all the time in this period for reasons we cannot see in the record. The record was never designed to see people like them anyway. The dockworkers believed something much simpler than any of these academic ideas. They believed the ship was cursed, the pier was cursed, and the men who had asked the wrong questions about either of those things had finally found out why. The archive does not lie, but it does something much more frustrating by going quiet at exactly the wrong moment. The silence has a specific shape to it, and you can read that shape if you know what to look for in the dust. What survives from the Gloriana case is a partial customs filing, some entries in the Port Authority ledger, a short run of newspaper coverage, and a few references in later maritime accounts. For a minor coastal trader in 1872, that is actually a decent documentary footprint, but the problem is the massive gap right in the middle of the story. The port ledger entries are consistent and unremarkable up until that final docking, with tonnage recorded and docking fees logged, just like any other day. The handwriting in those ledgers shifts between at least 2 different clerks, which was normal for an understaffed office where the same man was not always sitting at the same desk. What is not normal is the total absence of any formal finding or notation after the discovery was logged. Usually, a vessel that came in with a dispute or a damaged cargo claim generated weeks of follow-up entries, but the final entry for the Gloriana just sits there without any notes. Nothing is marked as resolved, nothing is marked as pending, and the ledger simply moves on to the next vessel as though the line above it said something ordinary. The captain's log, or at least the portion of it that survived the years, is described in 2 separate accounts with enough physical detail to suggest both writers were looking at the same object. It was a bound ledger book, the kind standard issue for coastal captains of the time, with entries written in a compressed but legible hand. The final page shows the last dated entry positioned about 2/3 of the way down the paper, and everything below it is completely blank. The accounts do not agree on exactly where the sentence stopped, as one says it ended mid-word and the other says mid-clause. But both agree the ink trail ends without a period, or a crossed line. It is the abrupt stop you get when a pen leaves the page without the hand ever completing its thought. The newspaper accounts diverge from the official record in one specific way that tells us a lot about those first few hours. The Port Authority's initial log describes the ship as secured and the crew as absent. But the earliest newspaper account uses different language entirely. It describes the vessel as being found in an unusual state of order, implying that witnesses had been below decks and seen the personal effects and the galley and the quarters. Either the reporter had direct access to the ship, which would mean the scene was not controlled, or he was talking to someone who had been inside before the official inquiry even started. That gap between the institutional record and the newspaper suggests the first hours after the discovery were much less orderly than the paperwork implies. No crew member ever surfaces in any subsequent record under his own name, and that fact has been checked against the census records from 1880. Those records covered enough of the geography to catch most men who stayed in the region, and researchers have looked through the maritime employment records for Charleston and Savannah in the years that followed. The absence is total, and it is even, which does not look like a group of men who scattered and rebuilt their lives. It looks like men who either left the documented world entirely or who stopped generating documents because they were no longer alive to sign them. There are things that should exist but do not, like a coroner's finding or a formal notation that no bodies were recovered. We are missing a customs closure report and an insurance claim filing, even though a vessel docking with a missing crew would have generated a massive financial question for the owners. Any of those documents would have told us something about what happened on that ship. Their absence tells us something too, but it is just not the thing we need to hear. The pier where the Gloriana once tied up has long since vanished from the physical world. That specific stretch of the Charleston waterfront has been rebuilt and filled and repurposed so many times over the last 150 years that the original shoreline is buried under layers of urban renewal. It is a specific kind of erasure that happens when a city decides to look toward the future, choosing to stop maintaining the old, wooden infrastructure that connects it to the darker parts of its own story. What stood at that location in 1872 now rests beneath heavy pavement or the foundation of a modern building, lost to the harbor fill that pushed the city further into the water during the early 20th century. You will find no historical marker at the site today. There is no exhibit in the local museum, and if you go looking for a commemorative plaque, you will find only empty space and salt air. This absence is not some oversight by a city budget committee, but rather a deliberate choice in how the story of the coast is told. Charleston has always been remarkably thorough about which parts of its maritime history deserve a bronze sign, and which parts should be smoothed over until they are level with the ground. An unexplained mass disappearance from a minor coastal trader, occurring in a decade the city spent a century trying to forget, was never going to be part of the official tour. A few local maritime historians have spent years pulling at the threads of this case, digging through surviving insurance records and hunting for the names of the crew in old census data. Their findings, on the rare occasions they are published, always seem to lead back to the same dead end. They find more questions than the archives can possibly answer, and they are left with the distinct impression that the records were never intended to provide answers in the first place. The geography of this coast does not preserve the memory of the Gloriana, but instead it preserves the sharp, jagged outline of where that memory used to be before it was scrubbed away. I want you to look at the logbook again. Do not view it as a piece of supernatural evidence or a clever literary device, but look at it as a physical object with a cold, hard fact at its center. There is a sentence in those pages that simply stops. When a captain sits down to write in his log, he is performing a routine as natural as breathing. He is not composing a letter or thinking about his prose, but he is recording the data of his life in a habit so deep it happens almost automatically. He notes the weather, the position of the sun, the status of the cargo, and the heading of the ship. because that is what a captain does at that hour, in that chair, with that pen. For a sentence to break off in the middle of a word, something had to be powerful enough to interrupt a physical reflex. It was not a conscious decision to stop writing, but a sudden break in a lifelong habit. And that realization narrows the window of what could have happened in that cabin. Speed is the most obvious explanation for the break. Whatever event took place on that deck happened with such violence and such haste that there was no time between the act of writing and whatever came next. It was not a chaotic event that knocked the pen from his hand, because the ink does not smear or drag across the page in a frantic line. The thought simply ended because the time required to finish it was no longer available to him. There is also the possibility of choice, though it is a haunting one. The captain could have intentionally placed the pen down on the desk. He could have stood up and walked out of that cabin with the full expectation that he would return to finish the line, which makes you wonder what he saw through the window that felt manageable enough to face, but was actually the end of his life. The ship itself was a form of testimony that no one knew how to read. Every object left in its place, from the boots tucked under the bunks to the cold coals sitting in the galley stove, served as a record of the very last moment before the world stopped being normal. The Gloriana held that record perfectly until the day she was stripped out and put back into service by men who didn't care about her ghosts. She was the most honest witness to the crime, yet the authorities treated her like common property. This story follows a pattern that runs through the history of the post-war South like a dark seam of coal through a mountain. There were so many things in this era that were inconvenient to investigate or remember, not because of a grand conspiracy, but because of a simple, systemic failure. The institutions of the time did not believe the lives of underpaid sailors and freedmen were worth the paper it took to document their deaths. 11 names were written in a ledger, and when those men vanished, the ledger simply moved on, because the book was never really about the people inside it. That is the true meaning of the sentence that ends in nothing. It is not a mystery in the way a ghost story is a mystery, but it is a story of institutional abandonment. Those men were there, and then they were gone, and the system responsible for their lives decided that the accounting was not worth the effort of a final period. 11 men stepped onto that deck, and the historical record simply lost track of them, while the cargo sat untouched, and a port clerk turned the page to a new day. The ship log ended on a sentence that no one ever bothered to finish. Subscribe for more stories the South buried and then forgot. It buried. The rope is still tied to nothing.